Hello, welcome to Pipeline Integrity, things that make me go, This is part 3 in my video series. My name is Colin Scott. I'm a pipeline integrity engineer based out of Calgary, Alberta, up in Canada. Today's topic is going to be surface crack assessments using the NG18 based equations. So by that I mean the original Log-Secant model. I will not be talking about through-wall crack assessments today. I won't be talking about leak rupture boundaries. We'll get to that later on in video number 5. Now, those of you that have done any validation work with the original Log-Secant model know that the model itself is it's inherently overly conservative. And this is probably costing people an awful lot of money in doing repairs that really aren't necessary. So what I'm going to do today is to talk about the reasons for that over-conservatism. Now, quick spoiler alert, the reason for the over-conservatism is because the model is fundamentally, mathematically, and theoretically wonky. I can think of some other words to describe it, other adjectives, but I'm trying to keep this video family friendly. So let's take a look at the original Log-Secant model for surface cracks. This is in what I call the sort of the unfolded format. We have a remaining strength, which is the predicted failure strength divided by the flow strength. And that's equal to our typical NG18 type ratio. We've got a 2 over pi. We've got arc-cos exponential. The k squared is the toughness of the material, a factor of 8 in there. C is half the crack length, and then we have a flow strength down there as well. We have an M, a Foley's factor in there, which if you've seen videos number 1 and number 2, I'm not a particular fan of for use in surface flaw analysis. That Foley's factor is based largely on length, which really is not super important for surface crack. Now, those of you that are familiar with this equation, or those of you that have seen videos number 1 and 2, know that the front half of that equation, the head of it, can be used for corrosion assessments. And I demonstrated in my previous videos that that mathematics is fundamentally wonky and leads to an over-conservatism in corrosion assessments. Now, let's do a quick validation of that original Log-Secant model. I'm going to use what I'll nickname the Battelle data here. This comes from ASTM report in July of 1973. And this includes 2 iconic data sets that were used for the original validation of the Log-Secant model. We have 48 data sets for surface breaking cracks. That's what I'll be talking about today. And we also have 92 data sets for through-wall cracks, but we're going to hold off on that and discuss that a little bit more in video number 5. Now, I will tell you that the 48 data sets for surface breaking cracks are not 100% complete. In some cases, there was no toughness data available for the sets, and so what I've done in this analysis work is to assume 34 joules toughness. That's equivalent to 25 foot-pounds, which is what Kiefner recommends in a recent report. So when I plot up the predicted failure strengths on the y-axis and the true failure strengths on the x-axis, I see that my data correlates fairly well, but it's overly conservative. We know from this plot that if you're in the upper left portion of the plot, you're going to be non-conservative, and that's going to represent potential safety problems for your pipeline. The data points in the lower right are overly conservative. That's good in that you have a safe pipeline, but if you're the one that's paying the bills, having an over-conservative model can add up quite a bit and cost you a lot of money unnecessarily. Here I have a trend line through my data which says y equals 0.88. So that means that the model is inherently about 12% overly conservative. Now, if we take a closer look at the mathematics here, we find a couple of interesting things. The first one is I've got this section highlighted in blue, and there we've got a Foley's factor. We've got the arc-cos exponential term, including the half crack length. Now, that arc-cos exponential term, that's all derived from a mathematical theoretical fracture mechanics model called the strip yield solution that was developed in the 1960s. That's based on a through-wall crack, and therefore it's all based on length. So everything I've shown here in blue is mathematically and theoretically based on length, which is not super relevant for surface crack. The pink section there is the empirical depth correction to account for a surface flaw. So let's have a think about this. We have a surface crack in which depth should be the most important parameter, but we're working with a model which was developed initially based on length parameters. So It occurs to me that there's probably a better way to do that. What I've decided to do is look at the model development, and rather than zigging and then zagging, I've decided to zag and then zig. Rather than starting with a through-wall crack, going through the whole strip yield model solution, and then empirically correcting for depth, I've just done everything in reverse. I decided to go through the strip yield solution for a part through-wall crack, get to the end of the formulation, and then do an empirical correction for a finite length crack. So what I came up with is what I call the gamma exponent model, or GEM. You'll see that it's got a very, very similar format to what we've just seen. We've got a remaining strength, which is the predicted failure strength over the flow strength. I've now replaced that empirical term that NG18 knows and loves, and I've replaced that with the remaining ligament to the power of the gamma exponent. Then I have a very similar 2 over pi arc cos exponential term, but you'll see I've switched out the 8 factor for a 10 factor, and I've switched out the half crack length for the crack depth. At the bottom, you'll see I have a gamma exponent, which is equal to the minimum of the length over the radius of the pipe up to a maximum of 1. Now, I'd like to say that remaining ligament to the gamma exponent, that is not an empirical equation that I just sort of pulled out of thin air and seemed to work. When I go through the strip yield solution for a part through wall crack, I need to include a back wall correction factor. The back wall correction factor I've used is the square root secant pi over 2 a over t term. And when I propagate that through the strip yield solution, I end up landing on that remaining ligament term. The gamma exponent used to correct it is slightly empirical. If you'd like to see the mathematics behind that, that's all available in my ASME journal paper, which I can show you at the end. You'll see that I've switched out the 8 factor for a 10 factor. What that comes down to is you need to dust off your fraction mechanics textbook from college, and you'll find that if you are doing a stress intensity factor calculation for an edge crack, you typically put in a 1.12 compliance factor in there. When you go through all the math, that term gets squared and multiplied by 8, so you end up with 1.12 times 1.12 times 8, which rounds off to pretty close to 10. So that's where I stand with the gamma exponent model. Those of you that have seen videos number 1 and 2 know that I've used the front of that equation, the remaining ligament to the gamma exponent, as a corrosion model. And if you've seen the numbers, you'll see that that actually improves quite a bit over the typical NG18 based equations. Now, if you think about this, I now have probably 90% of the equation here is based theoretically on a strip yield model, but it's based on depth. What we saw before in the original Log-Secant model was a good chunk of that equation was based on length, which is really not super relevant to a surface breaking crack. Here we've got the majority of it based on depth. So I think that that's a step in the right direction, but obviously we want to check that against our original data. I will tell you that there's some fine print in this model. The flaw depth can be modified by, say, a pi over 4 factor to approximate a semi-elliptical profile. So I'll use that for something like a fatigue flaw or a stress corrosion crack, which has got some curvature in it. I've also developed some correction factors for stress corrosion cracking shielding effects. I use a 0.63 factor if I'm trying to calculate expected failures out of a hydro test program in the field, or I'll use a 0.84, a more conservative factor if I'm concerned with service failures. The second point here I've got is that the Kmat toughness that I use for the validation is the lower bound Wall-on-J Sharpie correlation. I do not recommend the Sharpie over area correlation that's typically used for the Log-Secant model. And this is such an important thing that I've actually put together a whole video. Video number 4 explains why I believe the Sharpie over area is not appropriate, but the Wall-on-J is appropriate. I'm using a flow strength for validation of yield strength plus 69 or 10 KSI. I haven't messed around with that at all. Got thin wall pipe simply because the derivation is essentially a flat plate solution. So I require that D over T is over about 20. And you'll see from videos 1 and 2, if you've seen those, that the gamma exponent limit for the metal loss or the corrosion flaws is 1/2. Now there is a theoretical reason for that, but to understand it, you would have to dig through my ASME journal paper. Now here you'll see that when I do the same validation as I did before, but using the GEM model, things line up a lot better. Like before, I've got my predicted failure strength on the y-axis and compared to the true failure strength on the x-axis. And you'll see that these data points line up very, very well along that unity line. The slope of y equals 0.98x means that the model is about 2% overly conservative on average, but that's not too bad. You'll see that there are a few overly conservative data points which pretty much offset with the non-conservative data points. My feeling is that we should be targeting accuracy in our models before we start thinking about adding conservatism through lower bound properties or adding tool tolerances. So it seems to me that doing that correction and moving from a length-based model to a depth-based model is really a good step in the right direction. Now, if you look at all the other industry models that are available, original and modified Log-Secant model for surface cracks, API 579, British Standard 7910, Corlas, European R6 model, and PRCI MAT8, you'll find that all of these models will include some way, shape, or form of using the NG18 equation that uses a Folies factor, or they're based on a through-wall length strip yield-based model. So as I've been discussing for all three videos now, length is really not super appropriate for surface-based flaws, but for some reason we seem to have a real length dependence in all of these models that we're using. If you look at things like API 579, British Standard 7910, European R6 model, and PRCI MAT8, those are all based on failure assessment diagrams, and typically the x-axis on those where you're looking at ductile behavior, those are going to be based on a strip yield model solution. So you kind of have it buried deep into the mathematics, and most people are not necessarily cognizant of that, but there it is. At this point, I have not talked about the modified Log-Secant model. That was essentially developed a few years ago to try and correct the conservatism that I've discussed here in the original Log-Secant model. But that modification was really just a mathematical, fudge correction factor that was used to straighten the numbers out a little bit. It didn't really address the underlying problem. So let's think about this. The oil and gas industry is valued at something like $3 trillion worldwide. There are 2 million kilometers worth of transmission pipelines around the world if we look at both onshore and offshore. We can also think about laterals, and we can think about gathering lines and distribution lines and countless mileage of facilities piping. Now, there's a lot going on there, and that's a very expensive industry. If you look at this, I've mentioned that the models that we're using are actually length focused, and that's not necessarily correct for a surface breaking flaw. The original Log-Secant model is not the only one that's overly conservative. They're all overly conservative in some way, shape, or form. And my feeling is because the mathematics is fundamentally wonky. We're unwittingly focusing the mathematics of all this asset integrity work on length when we should be focusing it on depth. And I think I can show you with the GEM validation that correcting that problem really straightens things up a lot. And that's potentially worth billions of dollars to industry. A lot of YouTube videos you'll see will have a disclaimer where people say this has been done by a trained professional. Do not try this at home, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to encourage you, please do try this at home. There are going to be a lot of people that are skeptical of what I'm saying here and think I'm a crazy person. I strongly encourage you to take a look at either the Battelle dataset, which I've shown to you, or perhaps you have your own datasets in your office to look at. Try the original Log-Secant model, try the GEM model, and I think that you'll see that the GEM model is a step in the right direction. Only you can convince yourself that I'm not a crazy person, so please do that. If you're interested in this and would like to do some further reading, I do have 3 real publications here. Please look them up if you're interested. The last one on the list there is an ASME journal paper, which goes through all the mathematics of the GEM derivation. So those will be of interest only to the serious math nerds like me. If you've made it this far, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. I hope you've followed the logic in what I've discussed here, and I've given you something to think about. For the next video, I'm going to be looking specifically at the Sharpie over area toughness correlation, and I'm going to explain to you why I think it's fundamentally inappropriate to use that. After video 4, we'll go to video 5, and hopefully I'll bring a few things together that demonstrate how and why I believe these models kind of went in the wrong direction 50 years ago. Until next time, thank you very much for your time. Bye.